Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to get started. Um, Thank you so much, first of all, to the Illinois Office to Prevent and End Homelessness for sponsoring these Wednesday webinars. We will have two more webinars coming up the following two Wednesdays, so look out for communications around that. The next one will be around community engagement and zoning, and the third one on the 21st, May 21st, will be about development and operating budgets. So just gonna dive right in. My name is Jessica Nepomniachtchi. I'm the Managing Director of Real Estate Solutions here in Chicago. Today, we're going to talk about who IFF is and our learning objectives, review the phases of a facility project, talk about real estate readiness in a facility project, review some shelter case studies, and then leave some time for questions at the end. So about IFF, we are a community development finance institution, a nonprofit that strengthens other nonprofits by providing leadership, real estate, and capital solutions. We partner with other municipalities, government, philanthropy, and lenders to ensure access to capital in all over Chicago Metro and Midwest. We do that by prioritizing the following values. We seek to be an anti-racist and anti-oppressive institution. We respect partnerships like this one with the state of Illinois. We balance tensions regarding all of the different components of a community development process. And really importantly, we steward with heart. We understand that long-term vision and long-term facility visioning requires long-term partnerships. So we're in it for the long term with you and really look to support your facility project from both a real estate capital and organizational capacity perspective. Like I said, IFF is a community development finance institution. We do program management and development. For example, we've done programs regarding early childhood in Michigan. We also do research, evaluation, and planning to look at service gaps, for example, for early childhood, and then see where facilities might be needed. We also do our own facilities, working with our Home First program and development program to create housing solutions for folks with disabilities. We're also a lender, capital solutions, and provide different loans, products to nonprofits. And then I sit in the real estate solutions team. A bit about our capital solutions team. So we provide accessible capital to nonprofits. We specifically know how to work with nonprofits, understanding the cash flow challenges with grants and reimbursements. We provide 5 to 15-year loans, and financing can really range from as small as $10,000 to $6.5 million or more. Really importantly, we do a construction bridge loan product, which is super necessary for organizations that are using capital grants from government entities that usually come in at the very end of the project and need to be bridged. And we also have different arts and culture products as well as a flex loan program. So if anyone is interested in talking later about our capital solutions, please reach out to me. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I'm with the real estate team. We really look at ourselves as a nonprofit facilities planning thought partner. So we provide expertise and advice from the very beginning of a facility project, which could just be feasibility and visioning and understanding how your facilities engage, interact with your strategic plan. And we also do, pre-development services, which is capital financing applications, development team selection, procurement, especially when you're working with public financing, making sure that you're in compliance with all the local hiring requirements, federal requirements related to environmental. And we also do design and construction oversight with a team of owners representatives who support projects that are in construction. Like I mentioned before, we work all over the Midwest and in varying geographies, bringing sector expertise in healthcare, early childhood, emergency housing, shelter, affordable housing, and all other types of facilities. And we really look to be affordable, flexible, and responsive, knowing that there isn't one cookie cutter approach to how a nonprofit may need to approach their facility project. Today, the learning objectives are reviewing the phases of a facility project and helping to understand what stage you might be in, whether that's feasibility or pre-development, and then thinking through real estate readiness in the context of emergency housing and shelters, and community development and risk assessment, and then sharing project stories to find inspiration and to understand common challenges. So wanted to take a step back and just be like, well, why are we here today? Why is the Office to Prevent and Homelessness sponsoring this series? A lot of us know that prior to the pandemic, many shelter operators were using a rotating shelter system that looked at emergency housing and shelters, often secondary uses allowed by the zoning code. And so a lot of shelters are in basements of religious congregations or community centers, and the zoning code really hasn't been open and flexible to creating fixed site permanent shelter. The result was individuals, as many of you know more than I do, people experiencing homelessness had to get to a different site every week, and that had a variety of different outcomes. During the pandemic, shelter operators received temporary funding to lease hotel rooms and provide emergency shelter, supported with specific pandemic resources that were time limited. And that really created a historic investment in public infrastructure projects for the state of Illinois. That created 2023, the Office to Prevent and End Homelessness, that's coordinating policy across the state to end homelessness. There's also a capital infusion into emergency and transitional shelter, as well as funding from the Illinois Housing Development Authority for housing for justice-involved individuals. And we've seen an increase in community support and engagement for zoning and licensing. So that's part of the context, which I'm sure many of you are way more familiar with, but I wanted to also ground us in, these questions, because when we think about a facility project, it's not just, a real estate project. It's about how does this tie to your strategic plan? What role do facilities play in delivering your program? Is your space working for you? Are you in an accessible space? Are you in an inaccessible space that's making it difficult for you to serve clients? Thinking through, do you need to create, space for social service partners that you want to bring into your building that you haven't before, and then thinking about who's going to participate in your planning strategy, what role does your board play, and understanding if your organization itself has the expertise on your staff or board to engage in a facility project now, and if not, who might those team members be? So wanted to call out that owning properties can, support a higher level quality of program and financial health by adding to net assets. So this is one of the major benefits of owning real estate. However, it does require that staff maintain properties so that they remain financially sustainable and mission sustainable. And so obviously here we're going to talk mostly about the real estate process today, but I do want to call out, and we'll talk a little bit more later about, linking your facility project and your capital funding with sustainable operating funding to ensure that your occupancy costs are covered if you're adding new employees to a permanent fixed site shelter versus maybe relying on volunteers. So going to dig in to the phases of a facility project. I really like this visual because it does show you the different phases. However, I do want to call out that the phases here are not necessarily linear. We see a lot of folks who come to us that already own their buildings. And so, they don't need to engage in a site search, but they do need to engage in a pre-development process. And that pre-development process might be procuring the architect, securing the financing. A lot of shelters actually might be doing construction and occupancy at the same time, because you may not be able to empty out your facility altogether in order to keep beds open. And so a lot of shelters we work with have to do, phased construction and occupied rehab, which adds a different element, a different challenge to the process. And so I like to show this visual, but also like to say that it's, not necessarily linear. You may be engaging in feasibility and go straight to site search and then realize that the site you were looking at fell through, or it's too expensive, or it's not in the geography that you need, and you're back to feasibility. So at the feasibility stage, you're really defining the project parameters. So thinking through how your space and facility impacts your mission, and how does it serve your community and clients. So what's the business plan? Is it wraparound social services? Is it 24/7 shelter? Is it health clinic? How much space is required? And of course, your geography, and then unique facility requirements. So housing, shelter, childcare, health centers, these are all spaces that might require unique build outs that may be different than an open office floor plan. And then, of course, thinking about the opportunities and challenges in terms of leasing or buying. Identifying potential funding sources at feasibility is really important, because some funding sources are tied to your geography. If you come to the webinar on the 21st, we're going to talk a lot about funding sources, but the ones listed here are ones that we see used commonly, except for opportunity zones. But I like to put that there to show people that this tax incentive is available, but both new markets and opportunity zones are geographically based funding sources. And so that's where site search comes in to be really important early on, to understand what funding is available in your location. During the feasibility stage, it's also really important to figure out who is the decision maker on your team. Is it your staff? Is it your board? Is it a facilities committee? And what are the decision-making criteria? Is your criteria to make your facility warm, safe, and dry and accessible? Is your criteria to make the facility energy efficient? Is it to expand bed capacity? Is it to decongregate? Is it to transition from temporary shelter to permanent? So a lot of questions there that are asked at the feasibility stage to understand what your assumptions are related to site search budget. As I mentioned before, the money, the dollars and cents, and both the capital alignment and the operating alignment during feasibility is also really important. So making sure that staff and board are aligned on your project budget based on your property size and informed by construction assumptions, and then your operating budget, estimating annual operating revenue that really impacts expenses and any changes to occupancy costs. So if you're going from, like I said, a temporary shelter or a permanent shelter, are you adding new staff? How do you fundraise for that staff? What does that look like in your operating budget? And then potential capital sources of funding. So having some capital funding tied to location, is this funding important to you? Comes in early when you're looking for a site. Also recommending that, you establish geographically defined boundaries, and that those boundaries obviously fit the needs of the communities and clients that you serve when you're looking for a proposed site for your facility project. So thinking through your geography and your space needs. So, do you need, and other criteria. So for example, do you need parking nearby? Is this located near transit? Do you need your facility to be located next to a health center? Are there other educational opportunities within your community that you want to locate your facility at? So thinking about your criteria and your space needs and your geography. This provides an overview of what site search looks like. And, I say 3 to 6 months, but this really depends on your assumptions, your needs, the market. And, are you working with a broker? Are you considering off-market properties? Are you considering former archdiocesan properties or publicly owned properties by the state or the city? And what would that look like? And so identifying those site search requirements we talked about in this stage early on will help you just decide, where to put your short list of properties. And then IFF, one of the things that we do in our role here is site search, facility assessment. So, we go and look at the property to understand what the condition is and work with nonprofit potential owners so that what you might need to invest in immediately if you acquire a property in terms of code violations or environmental. And having that kind of inspection ahead of time helps you prepare for the next step, which is the budget. It helps prepare for understanding what your acquisition hard costs and soft costs might be. You might need to revisit your site search if, again, available properties don't meet your program search area, square footage, or budget. We talk about real estate readiness later on, and it comes up in site search as well. So when you're engaging in a purchase and sale agreement or lease negotiations, you're going to need an attorney. You're going to want to complete due diligence, which is a lot of reporting on the property. Like I said, inspections, environmental survey, and of course, understanding the zoning is really important for emergency and transitional housing to make sure that you either understand that you can need to get a special use or a rezoning or work on getting the community support for that. Pre-development phase can be a very long phase depending on an organization's capacity to fundraise and an organization's capacity to actually engage in a real estate process. So we kind of break down the pre-development phase in these headlines here. So financing and fundraising. So, understanding what your capital sources are, commitments versus pending, if you would need a bridge loan, and the timing of your funding. So if all of your funding is coming in at the end of construction, do you need a bridge loan up front? Do you have cash on hand, or do you need to go fundraise to pay for an architect during the planning phase? And then site due diligence. So like I said in the last slides, conducting those inspections, testing, engaging in a development team building exercise. So engaging with an architect to understand schematic design, engaging with a general contractor to get cost estimates, also engaging with the GC to do the bid process, especially important as it relates to public funding, and then project readiness, making sure that you have your permits, your zoning, and you're ready to go. At construction occupancy, this is pretty straightforward, right? The construction costs and duration of your project will really depend on your size and scope of the renovation. So some shelter operators might be buying a hotel and, they have the floor plan and the layout of what's needed, and maybe the renovations are minor or moderate, right? Changing some layout, increasing, enhancing building systems, changing the windows, and some renovations might be more gut, like stripping a building to its core and needing to completely reconfigure the floor plan to meet your program needs. I want to talk about the role of the owner's representative. It's a pretty vague title, but the owner's representative, is really a key member of your facility and development team. So IFF works with project managers and owner's reps. Owner's reps typically have an architect and design background, and they work with the nonprofit day in and day out to understand the project budget, the project scope, attend regular owner architect GC meetings, track and approve contingencies and change orders that happen throughout the construction process, and ensure compliance with different payment requests, and then ensuring, that you're doing your procurement as you would need to if it's a public funding source. Turnover and occupancy, inspecting and accepting the work and really learning about your new system. So coordinating your warranties with your general contractor, train your maintenance staff, and reviewing all of the important things, important renovations that have happened to close that process out. We're going to pivot back now to real estate readiness, which I really see as these kind of 6 major things that we'll go into detail, but site control, site conditions, due diligence, zoning, design, general contractor, and budget. And so all of these, work together at different times throughout the pre-development process, but are really tied to both real estate readiness and capital readiness. So we see a lot of nonprofit clients and shelter operators that come to us that have, some funding raised and need to still raise the rest of it, but want to proceed with real estate readiness because, you need to procure your environmental reports to understand what your total budget is if you have to remediate lead and asbestos. So first things first, site control. Do you have a site identified? Do you want to buy it? Do you want to lease it? Is it under contract? Is it publicly owned land? If it's publicly owned land by a municipality or a city, do you have a right of entry, a legal agreement to get into that parcel to understand the site due diligence, which I mentioned comes next, which is really knowing, the condition of the soil. So a geotech report, doing a survey to understand the utilities and the topography, which is needed to inform your architectural drawings, environmental reports. So understanding if there's any underground storage tanks, any contaminated land, lead and asbestos, especially crucial in older buildings that many shelter operators are using right now. Any public funding that comes into the facility would need to include, remediation of lead and asbestos and other hazardous materials. So you can get yourself ready at the beginning of a real estate process by engaging in this site due diligence. And then very crucial for this audience is the zoning. So, zoning is tied specifically to each municipality. And so, we're not zoning experts all over the state of Illinois. But I can tell you that I'm sure many of you know that zoning can be a long and arduous process, especially when it comes to emergency housing and shelter. And so working with an attorney early on to understand, how is your site zoned? Do you need to get a special use? What does that special use process look like? What kind of community support do you need? What kind of political support? And also, what kind of funding support do you need to go through a zoning process? Do you have to pay zoning attorney fees? Do you have to pay zoning fees? Do you have to pay architectural drawings to, do the zoning process early on? And so these are really important considerations. Most special use permits are tied to the population served and the number of people served in each building. So if you're engaging in a facility project at an existing location, but you're changing your population, you're serving men, but you want to serve families, or you're serving 50 folks, but you want to serve 100, that would require typically a change in your special use. So even if you're an existing operator, making sure that you understand that any new programming abides by your zoning. Building a team. So you will see here that building a team is much more than just an architect and general contractor. This is just some of the folks and team members that we recommend nonprofits work with to facilitate a successful construction project. Of course, architecture and engineering, we often recommend that you bring on a general contractor for pre-construction services early on as well. So when you do schematic design planning, that is the most basic and primary plan set that doesn't really often engage with mechanical, electrical, or civil engineers. And so when you get to your next plan set, you always want to have a GC, a general contractor on board who can cost estimate at each set of drawings so that each set of drawings what the scope is and what needs to be fundraised for or what needs to be taken out to make the project feasible. And so hiring a general contractor for pre-construction services can be a really great way to mitigate risk and understand your costs as the plans evolve. Like I mentioned, environmental. Geotech is soil testing. If you're, doing a new facility, making sure that the soil in the ground can hold the weight of the new facility. And then, shelter operators have a lot of different furniture, fixture, and equipment needs. So a lot of the items on the right are not typically included in a general contractor cost estimate or even contract. So owner contracts, so you as an owner would, work with an owner's rep to find a furniture vendor, find a security vendor, find, if one of your goals is to become more energy efficient and reduce costs for energy in your operating budget, work with a commissioning agent. And so, shelters have unique build outs, number of beds, dressers. Different shelters prefer to use like metal beds, not use wood. There's a lot of different considerations that you as a shelter operator might need to think about when you're securing, your furniture, fixtures, and equipment as it relates to your program. And then I also want to call out what I'm saying here around low voltage CCTV. So this is really a technical term for saying security. Security may be something that's really tied up into your zoning in a local municipality. So a zoning special use might say, we allow this shelter to operate. However, we would like cameras on site. And so, a low voltage CCTV vendor will work with you to understand, the layered access controls, access into the building, how to best outfit your facility with the types of safety and security that you're looking for and that the community might be looking for. Going back to organizational capacity, as I mentioned before, this is, readiness is not just tied to the real estate brick and mortar. It is tied to your day-to-day as a shelter operator, your organizational capacity. So, you're all working full-time, you're all facilities managers, impromptu or not. And you're also leading your staff and serving your clients day to day. And so thinking through it feasibility, do you have the capacity to take on this type of facility project or the size? And how does that fit into your staffing and your staffing needs? And so that's why it's great to think early on in the project during feasibility, really identify who your project team is. Is that your board? Is that your staff? Do you need to bring in consultants to help you in this facility project? And if you're bringing on and building a board to support this kind of work, like do they have real estate experience? Do they have fundraising experience? Oftentimes we see a lot of nonprofits create facilities committees for the duration of their facility project that has staff and board that kind of co-lead this. And then, of course, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the operating budget and making sure that the real estate piece is tied to a sustainable business model, especially when it comes to needing working with funders, right? So funders are going to want to know, well, if you're expanding your beds from 50 to 100, how does your operating budget account for this increase in service? Or if you're going from temporary to permanent facility, rotating facility that might not be open 365 days a year, and they're only open during the winter, what does it look like for you to fundraise for more full-time staff? And so the operating budget and the sustainable business model will come through and tell that story. Project budget. We like to really ask clients and at the beginning of a project, does your scope drive your budget or does your budget drive your scope? And this is really a technical way of asking, will you raise whatever money you need to get the vision that you want and need, or will there be limitations on the funding that you can raise and that will drive your scope? So if you've been working for, years with a state of Illinois representative to get to get earmarks, and you get an earmark from a state rep, are you going to continue fundraising to build out a bigger program, or will you do what you need to do with the specific funding that you've been allocated? I think for most nonprofits that we work with, it's really a matter of both questions being asked at all times and knowing that sometimes your budget will drive your scope and sometimes your scope will drive your budget. So if your goal is to become an accessible shelter, you know that you need to build in your scope and your budget to create accessibility, and you're not willing to compromise on that, and you will raise funds to get an accessible building. And then other operators might say, you know, I can't do that. I only have 3 million and I need to focus on creating maximum bed count. And so this is really just about your priorities and how your organization views, you know, the success of your facility project. Um, Breaking down what a total development budget looks like, you'll have your hard costs. So those are the construction costs that will be paid for to the general contractor. You might have site work and utilities work, especially if you're doing any landscaping, new construction, accessibility work. Soft costs, oftentimes we see clients come to us in the pre-development phase and have all of their hard costs, so their construction costs, but did not necessarily include professional fees like design fees, permit costs, legal fees, project management, owner's representative fees, specific furniture, fixtures, and equipment build out, and then really importantly, financing fees and interest reserve. So a lot of the public funding in the state of Illinois comes in at the end of a project. And so many times operators and nonprofits have to access some kind of debt, whether that's a bridge loan for a capital campaign or a bridge loan for a public source, to be able to do the construction and then close it out in a timely manner. And so making sure that your budget includes assumptions around how much interest you may need to support the project throughout construction. And then rule of thumb is 10% of the total budget, 10% project contingency. So you will be required by any lender or funder to have a minimum of 10% contingency in your project to plan for unforeseen circumstances during the construction process. And so ensuring that you build that early on in your budget will allow you to know what you have to fundraise to later on. On the right-hand side, I'm just naming very vaguely, and we'll get into this more detailed on May 21st, but the sources available can be, and are usually a combination of public, private philanthropy, capital campaign, fundraising that the organization has done on its own, and debt. The operating budget, I'm going to say it again, is super crucial to funders to demonstrate organizational readiness and a sustainable business model and support for applications for capital funding. So if you're going to go ask for $5 million from your state rep or a philanthropic partner, they're going to want to know, how will you be able to sustain this program? So questions that come up in your operating budget as it relates to facilities are, you know, do you need new personnel? Do you need to diversify your revenue sources? Do you have property management staff now? If not, do you need that moving forward? Because like I've said, you might be moving from a temporary facility to a permanent facility. And then your occupancy costs. So insurance, big cost. Like I said, property management. Most nonprofits are real estate exempt, but I do put this in here because sometimes shelters co-locate with either for-profit health partners or, you know, other types of tenants. And so you just want to make sure that you're including any taxes if you're not exempt, because you might be leasing out a facility, you know, subleasing your facility out to a partner that might, you know, generate the need to pay for taxes. And then maintenance service contracts. So you may not have ever had an elevator before that functioned. Well, now that you're getting a new elevator, you're going to actually have to build in service contracts into your operating budget to maintain that and to ensure timely inspections. And then reserves. So this is really planning for long-term facility success. So do you have capital reserves? Replacement reserves if something breaks? You know, do you have a plan for putting funds in the budget up front to address these issues versus, you know, addressing them as they come up on a credit card, which I know many times we have to do that, but thinking through ahead of time what kinds of occupancy costs are going to be required in your new facility or expanded facility is super crucial to tell your story and, like I said, to support applications for capital funding. want to pivot a little bit to risk. So the way that we view risk here at IFF and our real estate team is really understanding the difference between expectations and realizations. So, um, you know, there's a lot of unknowns when we engage in a facility project, and there's a lot of uncertainty around real estate and timing of funding. And so, you may ask yourself questions like, how long will it take for me to fundraise? How long will I get the political support I need for a zoning change? What do I do if I was going to buy a property and I got all the support, and then the landlord, the seller raised the price and I can no longer afford it, and I just put all this money into the inspections. Unforeseen conditions once you get into construction. So you open up a wall and you see something that you need to mitigate, and that's what your contingency is for. And so I just kind of want to call out that risk is most likely often unavoidable in a real estate process. But working up front and with your team to understand what kinds of risks might present themselves within your specific organization and your specific facility project can help reduce harm to your organization and community later on. But I don't want to have anyone come out of this webinar thinking that we can avoid risk. Risk is an inherent part of community development and real estate. And so how we mitigate that is identifying those project assumptions and decision-making criteria early on. You as the nonprofit owner, shelter operator should always have alternatives for the decision making. You can either do accessibility, or you can do full accessibility or limited accessibility. You can do a mix of congregate and non-congregate. You can do medical respite with congregate. Like, there's always a decision and an alternative, but it is up to the nonprofit staff and board to get aligned early on what that decision-making criteria might be. So as I mentioned earlier, a decision-making criteria might be, we only have $5 million and we're going to make a project work with $5 million. Another, part of that would be, thinking through, where am I going to be in 6 to 12 to 18 months? If I'm at the beginning of a feasibility process and I'm fundraising, how do I create project assumptions like cost estimates based on actual schematic design plans early on, so that, in 8 months, you have an idea of cost escalation of what your, actual costs might look like, because the market right now we know is fluctuating in terms of construction materials. And then, engaging in what I mentioned before during site search, which is, understanding your site and understanding your property condition and your timing and availability of sources, and then design choices. So when you are at the very beginning of the design process, like I said, you're not really picking out your light fixtures. You're not really picking out your faucet fixtures. That comes later on in, construction drawings or another plan set. And so what is the information you can collect up front that will help you understand later what decisions you might need to make later down the line? And how is that tied to your availability of sources? So one of the major things we like to talk about is getting aligned with your real estate and your capital, and understanding the timing of when you need the money. Do you need the money to engage in feasibility, to do strategic planning, to do a feasibility analysis? Do you need pre-development funding to hire an architect to get to the plan? And where is that funding coming from? And then mitigating risk through the development team expertise. So choosing an architect that knows how to work with shelter operators and has an understanding of creating this kind of space with trauma-informed design principles, or working with a general contractor that has experience doing occupied rehabs. So like I said, a lot of affordable housing and a lot of shelter housing, might need to be an on-site rehab. So you want to make sure that you develop a team that, might be familiar with doing a rehab in place. So, making sure that you're procuring the right team. And like I said, getting all of those team members on board at the right time will help mitigate risk and reduce further harm later. And then, of course, contracts and your attorney. We at IFF typically use the AIA, American Institute of Architects software to generate contracts for architecture and design and general contracting. And, we recommend that you work with a lawyer to obviously understand liability and risk as it relates to your contracts, and to review all of your funding contracts, especially if there's federal funding, state funding, local funding, as those will have compliance elements tied that you'll want a legal team to review. Some of the key takeaways, because I just said a lot, are, things to consider here, which is, what is your organization's capacity to engage in a facility project? Where you are today? Where do you want to be in 6 months? And who is the team you need to align for that? Understanding the role of pre-development funding. So how do you get to your large capital award if you don't have cash on hand now? We often find nonprofits that are focused on the big dollar awards, but are less focused on, paying for the next 6 months of plans to get to permit, to get to your construction. And so that pre-development funding, I can't stress it enough. It's very limited. It's out there, but it's crucial to make sure that you can engage and pay your team members to get to your permit. Aligning capital with sustainable operations. So like I mentioned earlier, if you're expanding beds, do you need new staff? If you're expanding services, do you need a new program space and square footage? And what does that look like? And then construction phasing. So there's historically been very little to no capital for shelter projects. And right now, there has been an infusion of capital in the system with the state of Illinois. And so it's really important to align that capital with the actual timeline and the project scope. So some funding can only be used for construction costs, and you cannot use that same funding sometimes to pay for your architect fees. And so hiring an owner's rep or hiring a project manager to help you understand which sources can be used with which uses, and what is the timeline of those sources and the deadline by when they have to be spent, and then thinking through your schedule, how to create the feasible timeline within your project scope. I mentioned trauma-informed design principles. There's a lot of architects out there that are working on the intersection of creating spaces that allow for folks that have experienced trauma to, reduce harm and mitigate harm. I think, as we think about like the redesign of shelter spaces, you all on this call probably have a lot more to say, like I said, than I do about this, but I think we know of a lot of architects that are working in this sensitive area and have a lot of experience. So, thinking through the lighting in your community, thinking through, again, accessibility, creating quiet spaces. And so these are some of the key takeaways that I wanted to send you off with today. And then before we get to your questions, I wanted to just share a couple of case studies that we're working on. IFF has been working with various emergency housing providers in the state of Illinois for a long time, but specifically since 2023, the Office to Prevent and End Homelessness was created, and we started working with shelter operators during the pandemic who pivoted from, 2 hotels. And so this project, Housing Forward in Oak Park, Illinois, began leasing rooms at the Rite Inn, which is in downtown Oak Park, in 2020. And then fortunately, we're provided funding by Cook County to acquire the building. The building is a former hotel. It's 55 non-congregate rooms. It's on-site wraparound social services. It also has medical respite. During the pre-development phase, a zoning change was not required because I believe the municipality said that the lodging was applicable, and so they did not need to seek a zoning change. They're working with our team to support the architect selection and do design oversight, and then capital funding applications. I would say that, in this case, the budget is driving the scope. So a lot of the scope is related to creating what we call like a warm, safe, and dry space. So making sure that, you're addressing safety violations, code violations, making the space sustainable and accessible, and enhancing program spaces. Pre-development funding is coming from a local revolving loan fund here in Chicago called JCUA, and a capital campaign. Construction has not yet started. Right now, construction costs are approximately about 15 million. Again, that could change. We're in a time of unforeseen circumstances with, what's happening nationwide. And the capital stack, as you can see here, includes a variety of state and local funds. So DCEO, which is State of Illinois Legislative Earmark, they worked with their local legislator to get an earmark. The CDBG-CV Urban Infrastructure Grant, municipal funds, and then they have a request into IDA's non-congregate program. The next case study, shout out to Andrew, is Cornerstone Community Outreach. So working on converting this former congregate facility that's serving over 200 individuals in a warehouse type building into a residential non-congregate facility. So as you can see on the left, there's not a lot of windows. There's this garage. It's really not configured to be a non-congregate facility. And so this is really a question of, is the scope driving the budget? You really need to reconfigure this floor plan to address existing building conditions and create non-congregate rooms out of a congregate setting. That's really different type of construction than if you're doing, upgrades to an existing hotel that is already non-congregate. Also seeking pre-development loan funds from GCUA and other sources. Right now, this is the total construction cost. The capital stack is pending, but is, requested money from both the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. Both of these projects are in the pre-development process. So just grateful that, able to share stories out to, show what is possible, but knowing that, it is a long-term process to engage in this kind of project. I just want to end with, examples of the scopes of work that we engage in here at IFF. So we do technical assistance, which is really quick, like one-on-one, helping you navigate unexpected challenges. As I mentioned before, we also do feasibility assessment. So we start out working with you, understanding your agency's needs, strategic facility needs. We also do facility improvement plans and facility assessments. So we'll go and do an inspection on your property and understand what your low, medium, and high risk deferred maintenance needs are and come up with a plan for enhancing the space. And then, like I mentioned, project management and owner's rep services to guide you through the development and construction process. I'm gonna stop talking and leave it open to questions. If there's anybody who wants to ask a question in the chat or come off mute, feel free. Well, yeah, thanks. We're gonna send out a copy of this presentation to everyone who registered, and then I believe it'll also be posted on the Illinois Office to Prevent and End Homelessness's website. Andrew.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hi Jess, thank you. Andrew Winter from Cornerstone Community Outreach. Been working with IFF for some time now on our pre-development for our projects. Very excited. Does IFF also offer support in that kind of fundraising and other capital stack development outside of what you've shared today?
So we would typically say if you want to engage in a capital campaign to hire a specific consultant who engages in donor, funder raised capital campaigns. I would say our team here We'll try to find the capital if it exists for the project, although we are not fundraisers.
Great.
So if there's a grant opportunity out there, I will share it. And we, share resources all the time. But and like, do applications for financing. And always, try to connect people, funders and clients alike. But we are not a specific fundraising organization. All right. Well, if that's it, I really appreciate everyone joining us today. And be on the lookout for the next webinar around zoning and community engagement. Thank you again to the Illinois Office to Prevent and End Homelessness. Bye all.